everyone, welcome back. In today's video, I'm going to talk about how I use Posca pens. I'll be doing a demo of how I color this drawing, and I'm also going to give you some tips and tricks on how to use Poscas effectively, as well as different kinds of paper and canvas that you can draw on with them. So if that's something you'd like to see, go ahead and keep watching. I do want to mention that I have a pretty large collection of Posca colors, but you don't necessarily need to have this many if you want to start working with them. You can definitely work with a smaller set and a smaller color palette. I first started working with the soft color palette and I was able to get a lot of different variation just with these colors, so don't feel like you have to go out and buy every color that's available. You're also going to need something to draw on as well as any kind of pencil to do your sketching. I'm using a lavender color erase pencil. And then I also like to keep a piece of scrap paper and a paper towel nearby so I can test any colors or clean up any spills or drips. You can draw on a lot of different surfaces with Poscas, but you do want to be careful of the type of paper that you use because really thin paper can get a little torn up or start to pill with these types of markers. So you want to go for something that's either very smooth or a little bit thicker that isn't going to kind of tear up so much under the pen nib. This first one is on watercolor paper, and this is Strathmore Cold Press. And I actually don't mind working on watercolor paper with these pens because it's a little bit of a thicker paper, so it doesn't get too much warping. And as long as you're not layering the markers super heavily, you don't get too much pilling. And with the pilling that you do get, if you let the paper and the markers dry down completely, you can usually brush off some of the more noticeable pieces that were like torn up a little bit, and it becomes less noticeable. So this is a fairly good option, especially if it's something you have on hand already. Next up, I have the Yupo paper, and I have both the heavy and the translucent, and the only difference is the heavy is a thicker sheet than the translucent is. And Yupo paper is really unique because it's not actually paper, it's made of plastic, and so it has a very, very smooth surface. Because of this, there's no issue with pilling on these at all, which is wonderful, but because of the smooth surface, it can be a little bit more difficult to work with and to get an even application. So usually you will have to build up the colors, and that's totally doable with Poscas. You just have to make sure that each layer is completely dry before you color on top of it, and you should be able to get opaque layers. I did get a little bit of streaking and bleeding on this particular drawing, but I think that was because of my own personal markers. I think my black was starting to dry out a little bit, and the paint in my burgundy color was a little bit watery, so it did feather a bit on the surface, but for the most part, it's usually not an issue. I think that was just personal user error. The other downside to this, unfortunately, is that Yupo paper is very, very expensive comparatively to like Bristol or watercolor paper. I think like a 10 pack of regular size paper, not the trading card size, is somewhere around $30 for a pack of 10, so it's definitely not as cost efficient as some of the other options. Next up is Bristol paper, and this is the smooth surface, but I would not recommend Bristol, whether it's the smooth or the textured version, because the paper just gets torn up way too easily by these markers. This kind of paper tends to pill up immediately as soon as you put your first layer down, and it tends to also have a really uneven application, so as you layer the colors, the pilling just gets worse, the paper gets chewed up a lot more, and you generally end up with pretty uneven, messy colors and a lot of little paper bits everywhere. It also does warp the paper a lot too, probably because it's thinner than something like the watercolor paper. So overall, I wouldn't recommend it. It's just more difficult to work with and you end up with something that's a lot less satisfying. This last paper is the mixed media paper from the Mossery Co. sketchbooks, and for me this falls somewhere in between the Bristol board and the watercolor paper. It's not quite as textured or durable as the watercolor paper, but it doesn't pill as much as the Bristol board does. I do get a little bit of pilling, but I have found that if I wait for it to dry completely, I can brush off most of the excess bits that have torn up, and they're not super noticeable, and overall it's relatively workable. So even though it's not my favorite surface, it's a pretty good option. In this video, however, I'm not going to be working on paper, I'm actually going to be working on canvas board. This is my personal favorite surface to work on with Poscas because there's no pilling and there's no warping with it whatsoever, and you can get a pretty smooth application, and it's also much more of a cost-efficient material because at least at my local art supply store, I can usually get each canvas board for less than $1. I find them easier to work on than regular canvas because I can work on them flat on my desk and they also take up way less space, so it's a lot easier for me to have a bunch of them on hand. It can be a little challenging to work with because of how textured it is. It makes it a little difficult to get very smooth lines, especially when I'm outlining or doing something very fine and very detailed. And occasionally it'll also cause paint spray when it catches very fine tipped nibs. But for the most part, as long as I let it dry, I can go in and clean up any edges pretty easily. So overall, that's not a huge issue. I also want to talk for a second about the longevity of these markers. These are both the same color pen. It's the emerald green color, and the one on the bottom is one that I got about 2 years ago and have used pretty regularly, and the one on the top is one that I just opened. And this might not be super obvious in the video, but the nib on the older one has definitely started to fray and it's splayed out a bit, so it doesn't get as clean and fine of a line as the new one does. And in terms of the actual paint itself, it's definitely streakier and thinner and just not as opaque as the new one is. That's just going to happen with pretty much any supply you use. Like over time, there's going to be a degradation in quality because you're using up all of the pigment. But unfortunately, Poscas are not refillable. So over time, as you start to see the quality difference, you are unfortunately just going to have to replace them. But overall, they do have a pretty good lifespan. So don't think you're going to have to replace these after like a week or anything. All right, and now I'm just going to walk you through my coloring process, starting with picking out a color palette. I find it a lot easier to pre-pick out all of my colors to make sure everything looks good together and is cohesive before I commit to filling in anything. I'll go in and test the colors that I like by putting a little swatch in each area, and then when I'm happy with how everything looks, I can go in and start filling in everything. I usually work with pretty flat colors with Poscas, so I'll start by filling in all of the areas with just a single color, and then I can always go in and add more detail or shadow and highlight later. If you're working on a smaller drawing and the Poscas that you have a little bit of a thicker tip, it can be hard to get really clean, precise lines, so I found the easiest option is to work from back to front. All that means is I will be picking out the elements that are furthest back in the drawing and coloring those first. So that usually means filling in the background first. So I'm starting with the purple here, and then after that I'll go in and fill in the yellow shapes, and then I can start to work on the things that are closer to the front, like the bat and the main character. If I can, I'll outline smaller, more detailed areas using a smaller nib like I am here, and then after I have everything sectioned out, I'll go in with the same color in a larger nib size and I'll use that to fill in the space. This is just to preserve the nibs on my markers as much as possible because canvas is very rough and textured and it has a tendency to tear up your nibs a little bit, and filling in a really large area with a small nib wears it out a lot faster, so if I can use something bigger I usually do just because it's easier to work with. The first coat came out a little bit streaky, so I did have to do a second application to make it more opaque, and this can happen for a few different reasons. In this case, I was using a marker that is just a lot older and is starting to lose some of its pigmentation and some of its coverage, so I do have to layer it up to get the same opacity that I would with a brand new pen. But there will also be times when you just get a pen that has thinner paint. It happens with certain colors, and over time it can make it worse, and sometimes you just end up with a pen that's a little bit more watery and isn't quite as thick and opaque. And as long as you let the colors dry in between, you can layer them up just fine and get a pretty thick application. It just takes a little bit of patience. Throughout the video, you're also going to see me kind of drawing and swatching on the scrap piece of paper that I have, and I'm usually doing that to get the ink flow going on the nib. For the best application, you really want to make sure the paint is flowing really evenly, but sometimes your nib will dry out a little bit and it'll feel a little bit scratchy and it'll come out a little bit streaky. So if that ever happens and it feels like you don't have very good paint flow, just take a scrap piece of paper and pump the tip of the marker a few times, and that should help get the paint flowing again. Just as a word of caution, never ever pump your marker directly on the surface that you're drawing on. It doesn't happen super often, but every once in a while, if you're pumping the tip, especially with a thinner color, you can get a little puddle of paint that just shoots out of the tip. It can really make a huge mess, especially if you're working with a darker color, so speaking from experience, if you're working on getting the paint flowing, just keep it away from your actual drawing. I'm just continuing to fill in all of the flat colors. I'm not worrying about any of the details yet. I just want to make sure I get a smooth application of color for the base, and then I can go in on top. And I am getting a little bit of messiness with some of the outlining on things, but as long as I wait for everything to dry, I can always go in and clean up the edges, so I'm not too concerned about it right now. You'll also see me constantly rotating the canvas while I'm working on it, and that's just to make sure that my hand isn't brushing over any paint while it's still wet. I do tend to work in sections kind of all over the place just to make sure that any areas are completely dry before I touch them by accident or before I color next to them. Poscas dry really quickly, but if you put two wet colors next to each other, they can bleed. And again, especially if it's a dark color and it bleeds into a light color, it can make a huge mess. So It's a good idea to make sure any areas that are touching are completely dry before you add in any new colors. Darker and more saturated colors like this turquoise or like the darker purple will cover up any pencil lines pretty easily, but lighter colors like the skin tone or the yellow blobs in the background can show the pencil line through, so you'll have to layer it up quite a bit in order to cover those pencil lines. So when you're doing your initial pencil sketch, really want to make sure that you don't have a ton of excess lines everywhere if you're going to be working with light colors, because it's just more area that you're going to have to cover up later. After the base layer was completely dry, I went in and I started adding details, and I do tend to freehand most of my details. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, and I have to cover it up, but that's totally fine. And I focus mostly on getting some highlights in there and then adding some visually interesting elements like patterns or just fun decorative bits in the background. And right here is about to be a really good example of why I said not to pump your markers directly on your canvas, because this dark blue color that I use tends to spill a lot when I pump it, and right here's when I realized it had gotten all over my hand and then onto my desk. So luckily it missed my drawing completely, but if I had pumped it directly on my drawing, more likely than not I would have gotten a huge blob of dark color like right in the middle of it. Another little word of caution is when you're using light colors on top of darker saturated colors, even if they're completely dry first, sometimes the nib can pick up a little bit of that darker color. After I finished these little flowers, I noticed the tip was stained a little bit green on my white pen, so I just drew on my scratch paper a little bit to get that paint flowing and to clean out the tip, and then afterwards it worked just fine. But if you do this frequently, you can stain your nibs over time, so just be cautious of that. I also decided to freehand a little pumpkin on her skirt, and you'll see that I actually had to layer up that orange color quite a bit because it's a thin color. So even though it was saturated, the paint itself was very thin and didn't cover up completely, so I'm making sure it's completely dry before I go in and add any layers on top. Here, I noticed there was some staining on the nib of my ivory color that I wasn't able to get out, but the marker itself still had plenty of paint in it. So in order to fix that, all I did was I flipped the nib around. If you take a pair of tweezers and you pull on the nib, it actually pops right out, and it's the same on both sides. So if your marker still has plenty of paint in it, but the nib gets damaged or stained, you can just flip it over and it's like new. And then I'm just going in and I'm finishing any detail work with the coloring. I'm adding in some highlights and I'm cleaning up any edges. And then I'm adding in things like the face and the eyes on the bat. And it did come out a little bit messy, mostly because this like fine tip white pen I have is a little bit older, so it's a little bit blobby, but I was able to clean it up later by painting over some of the parts that I didn't like. And then I filled in some of the empty space just with some orange speckles. Also, I tried to add a little face to this pumpkin, but my marker was too big and his face came out so sad, but like I didn't want to color over it, so it just looks like that now. I do all of my outlining either with the bullet tip or the extra fine tip, and I actually find that the line width on them is pretty similar. The only difference being that there are some colors that are available as a bullet tip that aren't available as an extra fine tip, so it's really just about which colors you want to use. For this particular drawing, I am outlining in black, and that's just because I used this really dark purple and dark green, and this was dark enough to kind of outline those and still be noticeable. But if I'm using all light colors or pastel colors, I will usually outline in that purple color or in a dark blue color just because I feel like it's less harsh. I ended up doing most of this outlining off camera just because I work really, really close to my canvas and it ends up blocking the camera, so it was hard to show what I was doing. But I did end up actually having a really big mess up with the black ink. I created kind of a mess that I had to cover up with a light color, and I'll show how I ended up fixing it later, but it was kind of a big blunder. It took me a couple hours to end up fixing it. So yeah, I'll talk about that in a little bit. So this is the final outline, and I actually did struggle quite a bit with cleaning up some of the paint on her face because when I was drawing in the facial features and like the eyebrows and things, I had some really messy lines that got really blobby and kind of all over the place, and it made a huge mess. And the only way to cover it was with the hair color or the skin tone color, both of which are very light, very thin colors. So it took many, many layers and a lot of dry time to finally cover it up. And if you look closely, you can actually still see a bit of a gray tinge along the hairline, but overall, I think it's fine. It's not my favorite thing that I've done, but it's definitely not as noticeable as it was before. But I did end up giving her angry eyebrows because that is how I felt when I was done. Lastly, I just finished everything off with some more white highlights and a little bit of a white outline just to add some definition, and then it was all done. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope this video was helpful to you if you are just learning how to use Poscas, or maybe it even gave you inspiration to try them out if you've never used them before. They can be a little bit intimidating at first, but once you get used to them, they're actually really fun to work with, so I would definitely recommend giving them a try. If you have any other questions about them, go ahead and leave them down in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer them. And until my next video, I hope you have a great day. Bye!